Good evening and welcome to Peter Harrington for our webinar, which is opening the Box of Delights. What is the Box of Delights? Who is John Masefield? Why are we here? All sorts of questions, which hopefully we'll have an answer to soon. Big welcome to you all, but a massive welcome to Piers. We're going to introduce ourselves briefly, so over to Piers.
It's very good to be here. Thanks for having me, Phil. My name is Piers Torday. I'm a children's author. I've written such fancy adventures as The Last Wild and There May Be a Castle and The Lost Magician. But I also, with another hat on, write adaptations of children's stories for the stage. And the very first one I did, I can't believe it, it was still so exciting today, was John Masefield's Box of Delights. And we put that on twice at Wilton's Music Hall in London, and it's just opened for the third time at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon in a production of the Royal Shakespeare Company, and we'll be talking about that a bit as well.
And I'm Phil Errington. I'm one of the senior specialists at Peter Harrington, and I know more about John Masefield than is good for me. I edited the most recent edition of Box of Delights. I've written a book on the Box of Delights, and I live and breathe the Box of Delights every December. So that's really me. Whilst we're on that topic, I should say that for all you lovely people out there, we have we have two copies of Opening the Box of Delights, which is my book. Piers has written the foreword, and we also have the play script of the RSC adaptation. We will select two lucky email people at random, and they will receive a copy in the post, well, a set in the post of my book, signed unfortunately by me, but best of all by Piers, and also a play script signed by Piers. So there we go, a giveaway for people who are attending, not available, unfortunately, to the recording. So there we are. So the structure of this evening is that we're going to have a little introduction to who John Masefield was and introduce the Midnight Folk and, more importantly, the Box of Delights. And in order to keep this to a short-ish time frame, it's about 12-13 minutes. There's a pre-prepared video. So sit back, find a mince pie, indulge in a posset, and here's our introduction to Masefield and the Box of Delights.
Let's start by hearing the opinions of three poets about John Masefield. Yeats said, "You'll be a popular poet, you'll be riding in your carriage and pass me in the gutter." Eliot reflected that, "I think he is a poet of more historical importance than is usually put to his credit by writers of my generation and younger." And Betjeman wrote that John Masefield wrote two lyrics which will be remembered as long as the language lasts. Something has gone seriously wrong. Masefield published over 100 books. Only a handful are in print today. A journalist, Russell Langstrom, once reported that during World War II, someone asked the question, who would be the century's greatest man? Churchill, Roosevelt and Gandhi were proposed, and then someone suggested John Masefield, explaining that the others will be long dead, but Masefield's poetry will still be alive. Given that almost everything about Masefield is now dead, let's have a brief biographical sketch. Masefield was born in 1878 in Ledbury, Herefordshire. For 6 years he enjoyed the idyllic surroundings of the Ledbury countryside. Then his mother died after a riding accident. Just over 6 years later his father died too. The Masefield children, of whom there were 6, were entrusted to the guardianship of a paternal uncle and his wife. Aunt Kate viewed John Masefield's love of reading with suspicion. He was packed off to a school ship, HMS Conway, Aunt Kate hoping that this education would prepare Masefield for a career at sea and cure his addiction to books. Masefield's schooling introduced him to marine history, mythology and yarns. Above all, he discovered he had a gift as a storyteller. When he left school, he joined the Merchant Navy. The new apprentice was violently ill and he suffered a nervous breakdown. He was classified a distressed British seaman and returned home. Aunt Kate, yes, let's see her again, taunted her nephew with his failure, and arrangements were made for Masefield to join another ship, this time berthed in New York. Masefield had other plans, and upon arrival in America he failed to report for duty, vowing he was going to be a writer, come what might. It was now 1895, and Masefield was only 16. He became a homeless vagrant tramping the States for work. One theme throughout his writing is sympathy for the underdog. He was saved from starvation when offered a job in a New York bar. A little later he started work in a carpet factory in Yonkers. The long hours were bearable because Sunday gave him an opportunity to read. Eventually he threw up his job. It was time to return to England. He later wrote to a friend, "I landed in England with about £6 and a revolver. I was going to try to get a job as a clerk. Failing that, I was going to shoot myself. I was desperately ill and sick. I hadn't the strength to face more hardships." Aged 19, he became a bank clerk. Then, in 1899, he achieved a breakthrough. One of his poems was accepted for publication in a magazine. For Masefield, the time had come to approach his literary hero. It was 1900, and he was invited to dine with W.B. Yeats and was drawn into Yeats's circle of friends, including one who introduced him to an Irishwoman 11.5 years his senior. This would be his future wife. When in 1902 Masefield's first book was published, Saltwater Ballads carried a dedication to the future Mrs. Constance Masefield. He married in 1903, and a daughter was born the following year. With the financial commitments of a family, Masefield pursued work as a literary hack. Poetry didn't pay, however, and Masefield tried short stories, naval histories, novels, and drama. However, despite Masefield's creative efforts, he later described this period as a very real blackness of despair. He noted, "My work was not what I had hoped." Then, in 1911, Masefield published The Everlasting Mercy, a long narrative poem telling of the fighting and drunken debauchery of the fictional Saul Cain before a religious conversion. In 1911, this was sensational stuff. Lord Alfred Douglas, of Oscar Wilde fame, branded the work 9/10 sheer filth. One problem was Masefield's use of the word bloody. The English Review printed blank spaces rather than risk printing the scandalous word. Robert Graves later claimed Masefield's innovation had emboldened George Bernard Shaw to make the word his dramatic climax in Pygmalion, although one doubts Shaw needed much encouragement. With the outbreak of the First World War, Masefield was too old for military service. He therefore volunteered as an orderly at a hospital in France. Then he took charge of a motorboat ambulance at Gallipoli in 1915. And subsequently he became a spy for the British government. The UK was desperate to have accurate assessments of how America viewed the war. Masefield was therefore sent on propaganda lectures and reported back to Britain's War Propaganda Bureau. After the war, Masefield published Ren Up the Fox, another long narrative poem. It's about a fox hunt, but it's also Masefield's narrative of the Great War. The novelist and critic L.A.G. Strong called it a masterpiece, and Muriel Spark described it as a great poem. The Masefield family was now resident just outside Oxford. Neighbours included Robert Bridges, and Masefield, in attempting to help emerging talent, rented a cottage in his grounds to Robert Graves. He also built a private theatre in his garden to avoid the Lord Chamberlain's censorship controls. During the 1930s and 40s, Masefield had a fine run of successful novels, including The Bird of Dawning, Dead Ned, and Live and Kicking Ned. He was appointed Poet Laureate in 1930 and awarded the Order of Merit in 1935. Masefield's contemporaries would, I suggest, be amazed at our present lack of interest in him. With the Second World War there was more poetry, but Masefield's son was killed in the North African desert in 1942, and Masefield's serious ill health in the late 1940s and early 1950s led to his fading presence. Constance Masefield died in 1960, but Masefield lived on at Birket Brook, just outside Abingdon, adopting an increasingly reclusive lifestyle. But there was still poetry. The Bluebells and other verse, Old Rager and other verse, In Glad Thanksgiving, approximately Masefield's 39th, depending how you count, and final volume of poetry. Masefield died on the 12th of May 1967, and his ashes were laid to rest in Poets' Corner, the last poet so interred. Robert Graves delivered the memorial address. He stated that Masefield had been his hero, and that in him the fierce flame of poetry had truly burned. Remember Betjeman's comment? John Masefield wrote 2 lyrics which will be remembered as long as the language lasts. Is Masefield's reputation really based on 2 poems, a mere 6 stanzas, and work published in 1902 and 1903? His final book was published in 1967. In other words, can we dismiss over 6 decades of his work? White, male, and middle class, with royal approval he may have been, but his first book opens with a consecration, in which he pledges himself to the scorned, the rejected, the tramp of the road, and the dust and scum of the earth. As I said, he'd been a homeless vagrant. He also lectured for women's suffrage, wrote a brilliant anti-slave novel, campaigned for fellow writers, refused to receive an award in Nazi Germany, etc. He also wrote 2 brilliant fantasy novels for children, which is why we're here this evening. There are 2 books, The Midnight Folk, published in 1927, and The Box of Delights, published in 1935. L.A.G. Strong claimed the books were among the most sure-footed and robust books for children ever written. C.S. Lewis wrote that The Box of Delights was a unique work and will often be reread. The beauties, all the delights that keep on emerging from the box are so exquisite and quite unlike anything I have seen elsewhere. The Times called them 2 of the greatest children's books ever written. Long before the wizarding world of J.K. Rowling, there was The Box of Delights. Long before C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, there was The Box of Delights. And a few years before The Hobbit, there was The Box of Delights. Box of Delights and The Midnight Folk are Masefield's lasting contribution to children's fantasy literature. Identifying inspiration is tricky, but Aunt Kate died in 1927. 5 months after her death, she was immortalised for all time as a witch in The Midnight Folk. Masefield took his ultimate revenge. There had been magical fantasies before Masefield, but in Masefield's K. Harker books, children's literature entered a modern age of fantasy and ingenious invention. So what's it about? The hero, K. Harker, is entrusted with a magical device which enables the user to move swiftly and/or reduce in size. The box also allows the user to enter magical worlds and travel into the past. The scheming wizard, Abner Brown, and his accomplices, disguised as clerics, wish to seize the box and start a systematic kidnapping, or scrobbling, of all who may have been trusted with keeping it safe. This involves the disappearance of a cathedral staff and, as Abner's evil plans escalate, the gang intends to stop the 1000th celebration of Christmas in the cathedral. The book is a surreal combination of ancient myths with 1930s gangsters. It's a fantasy in which settings include the Trojan War and a railway journey. It combines piratical rats with feisty children. It's set at Christmas with all the seasonal traditions and games one expects. It combines Romans on a wolf hunt with gangsters in flying cars kidnapping people. It sends up sensational newspaper journalism, etc., etc. How can anyone forget Mariah Jones, the feisty young lady who volunteers her opinion that Christmas ought to be brought up to date. It ought to have gangsters and aeroplanes and a lot of automatic pistols. Crucially, the book was adapted into a radio broadcast in 1943. This was an important moment for Masefield. At the time the book was out of print, radio was crucial in creating a magic in the absence of the printed book. The same 1943 radio script was used again in 1948 and 1955. A new script was used in 1966. It was repeated in 1968 and 69. There was another version in 1974 and then 1977. Obviously, the book had a loyal following on the radio. Look at this clipping in the Sunday Times from 1970 in the personal column. Someone was desperate to join the Facebook boxers many decades before the internet existed. In the late 1970s, the BBC asked if they might make a TV adaptation. Negotiations would take years before the BBC finally committed, at that time, the largest sum ever given to a children's serial. Let's enjoy a trailer for the adaptation, which was first broadcast in 1984.
In my box are such delights.
Starting on Wednesday on BBC One, a new serial for children, The Box of Delights. The mysteries begin when young Kay Harker comes home at the end of term.
Can I give you a hat?
Oh, if you would be so kind, hold me steady as I swing her up, then I can get her to my back, where she rides a triumph. Only I do date from pagan times, and age makes joints to creak.
Do you keep dogs at Seekings, Mr. Harker?
How do you know my name and where I live?
Aha.
Magic? The wolves are running. Perhaps you will do something to stop their bite.
If you see someone, say someone is safe. Look out for fun, Master Harker.
John Masefield's classic story brought vividly to life with a wealth of wizardry and devilish tricks. Patrick Troughton, Robert Stevens and James Grout star in The Box of Delights on Wednesday at 5 o'clock on BBC One.
Suddenly, there was new interest in Masefield. The Box of Delights was on the front cover of the Radio Times. Acting talent in the series included the magnificent husband and wife team of Robert Stevens and Patricia Quinn. There was even a former Doctor Who in the person of Patrick Troughton. And some of the music, originally used in the radio adaptation, was skillfully reused. Healy Hutchinson's Carol Symphony is the trigger for many people here. The TV series has been called one of the most magical Yuletide dramas that the BBC has ever made. Unfortunately, and in a cruel twist, it was decided that 1980s children would be unable to cope with Masefield's original prose. The version of the novel that was published to tie in with the TV adaptation was abridged. Despite this, a momentum had started. In 1994 there was an amateur musical version, revived the same year, and 1996. In 1995 BBC Radio broadcast another adaptation, this time starring Donald Sinden, Celia Imrie and Spike Milligan. In 2005, the unabridged audiobook version was released. In 2007, I started work on an editorially sound version of the text, returning to Masefield's manuscript. This was published in 2008 in both the UK and US. The Folio Society used my corrected text with the new series of illustrations in 2012. What I hope to have demonstrated is that there is a huge following for this book. It has its fans, including one wonderful children's author. In 2017, Piers first adapted the book as a stage play. This was such a success at Wilton's Music Hall that it was revived in 2018. The following year, there was a dance adaptation performed in the streets of Hereford by the innovative Two-Faced Dance Company. In 2021, there was a new audio adaptation released on CD and download by Big Finish, including Derek Jacobi in the cast. And now, running in Stratford-upon-Avon, is the Royal Shakespeare Company's new production of Piers's adaptation. All this has been an introduction. If technology works correctly, let's now return to the Peter Harrington shop in Dover Street and start the conversation.
So there we are. Let's start the conversation. I hope that was a little bit of background. Piers, I suppose the first question to you is, when did you first read the book?
Well, like many people watching, the truth is I watched the TV first. That incredible series that you've given such a brilliant introduction to was, I think, for so many people who fall in love with this story, often their first introduction to a children's book, which is now quite old. And
it's 40 years next year.
It's 40 years next year. It's a long
run.
And I love the TV programme, and because it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was, at the time, I didn't realise as a child viewer, as you mentioned, the special effects were unheard of, certainly for a children's adaptation.
And they do sort of still stand the test of time. There are some that are
some
awful,
of them, like Flying Horses, are not. But
overall,
Going into Hearn's Wood is still magical. The opening of the box,
animations
and animations are really beautiful. So beautiful, and actually have a period charm to them now, which sort of goes with the feel of the book. And I remember, I think, like a lot of people were, I was quite frightened by it, because Charles and Joe on the train were very sinister, Abner's sinister. And when it came to the sort of Abner's watery death at the end, obviously we didn't have video or iPlayer or anything. And I didn't know it was going to become this hugely popular program that we screened every Christmas and wouldn't be able to escape from. So I remember dragging my mum home for some social event, desperate to not miss the end of this villain who terrified me.
Which was on Christmas Eve, which was the brilliance of the first broadcast, that as it ends on Christmas Eve, the BBC chose to broadcast it on Christmas Eve.
I don't know the weather reports if it snowed then, but there was a time when it did often still snow at Christmas, so the whole thing was thoroughly magical. And I then did race away. I was a keen reader. I raced away and devoured the book, which of course has so much more detail than you can ever fit into any adaptation, and fell in love again with all the characters. And actually, the book is not for, the TV series and adaptations have a magical sort of darkness to them. And actually, the book has a real thrill, but it doesn't have that. It's the book is a wonderful kind of consolation, I think, to readers young and old.
Yes.
So that would have been about, I would have been about 10 or 11, when I first read the book. And it is one of those books that stays with you because, and I think as someone's mentioned in the chat and you did in your talk, I think the longer it stays with you, the more you realise how much comes from it. So tropes and ideas of, domestic devices like a box that can take you to other worlds and other times, whether it's C.S. Lewis's wardrobe or the Doctor Who's police box.
Now, this is an interesting thing.
Yeah.
You raised this a few years ago.
Yeah.
I remember talking to you at
Yeah.
Wilton's about this, but there probably is some correlation between the Box of Delights having such a long track record at the BBC and someone just devising Doctor Who. The whole idea of time travel starts here.
And I've just been, like I'm sure some of our viewers have been, I've been rewatching this fantastic The Whoiverse, all these things released. And when you see Doctor Who, this very eccentric figure in, you know, yes, an alien and a Time Lord, but to all intents and purposes, a magician, because of the way the different doctors dress with extravagant scarves and waistcoats and cravats and hats, going back to Renaissance Italy or ancient Rome. You know, that is straight out of the Box of Delights. And I know Arnold of Tody could 100% be one of the people.
So we are now claiming that here we are. Anyone out there, we are claiming that John Masefield's The Box of Delights is an inspiration for Doctor Who.
I think there's something very striking in the way that that Father Bottledale, aka Abner Brown, is referred to. I think it is, you know, their master, the wolf's master.
Yes.
And look, these things go into the ether. I'm not making any claims. Just in the same way, J.K. Rowling, I'm sure, when she had a Ford Anglia flying in the Chamber of Secrets, it's not a direct like lift from Box of Delights. But the point is, Masefield's the first person to do it.
Yeah.
And, so,
and of course, Ford Anglia, yes, and then before that, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang.
Yeah.
But before that, I mean, anyone out there, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the earliest idea of a caroplane, a car that takes off and flies, is in the Box of Delights. And so you're right, it's got all these first ideas, seeds of literature which are developed, and even the language is taken and developed.
But what's so unusual about it, though, is it's got all in one book. So as a book, it's a bit like reading Narnia crossed with Lord of the Rings because of the battling wizards, crossed with Harry Potter had not been invented yet, crossed with Doctor Who, crossed with a sort of which you would never get now with any of those magical stories. In This Is Forgotten About box, the most fantastic sort of 1920s, 30s jewelry sort of gangster story, which is nothing to do with time travel or anything, but is about more like Raffles or Sapper, or one of those great sort of adventure stories of the period, which is about knocking people over the head and kidnapping them and breaking into posh houses and cathedrals and stealing diamonds. And I think it's Masefield's kind of, he's this sort of very generous genius, I think, and that he doesn't try and sort of perfect anything, which can often kill a book. He just allows all of these elements in, and neither is the story overwhelmed by them.
But it's a book that breaks the rules.
All the rules,
and takes little ideas and just runs with them.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people find that maddening or confusing. It's quite interesting, the people who might try the Box of Delights and say, I'm sorry, that is far too mad for me. That's not right. But it's this magic realism, which if you enter into the world, of the imagination, and you accept these things for what they are, it's just got a charm about it, or
it's entrancing, logic. And it is full of digressions, and I suppose it's closer in some ways to an 18th century novel in that sense, that it's almost got elements of Tristram Shandy about it, in the sense that it often goes off at very wild tangents, and he doesn't seem to mind that. But funnily enough, of course, and I'm sure many people here will read the book as children, or read the book to their children or grandchildren, and when I speak to people who do that, I hear time and time again how contemporary children who live in the world of Snapchat and iPhones and Twitch and all these things are also completely entranced by the Box of Delights. And in a funny sort of a way, there's a sort of madness to online life, to the internet. And I also
replicated in the madness of the
Box
narrative.
of Delights. I think if you understand the madness of that, Box of Delights doesn't seem so strange sometimes. And it's he's very faithful to his characters. Everything is eventually tied up, and
Yes.
it does all. It's not maddening in the sense that it's not surrealist. He doesn't just
No, everything is wrapped up in the end.
It's a very rich world, and I think what happened was writers like Tolkien and Lewis, and then particularly Rowling, and also Ursula Le Guin, took on this idea of world building, where they realized that actually the strength of creating one singular fantasy world with very clear parameters and magical logic was hugely appealing to people. But he hadn't discovered that. No one had discovered that yet. He was a pioneer. He was playing with these ideas of a box that could take you into sort of Hearn's world, but also you could be have bishops being scrobbled and by Nicara plane and on the front page of the newspaper and all that. So he's sort of I think people who don't take to him are people who perhaps are not instinctive early adopters. Don't want to speak for them, but he's a pioneer. He's one of a kind.
Yes.
And you either take great pleasure in that, or you'd rather read the sort of fifth iteration of that, which is your C.S. Lewis and your Philip Pullmans and so on.
I mean, it's mad. It's very different.
Yeah.
And I also think, actually, in what you were saying there, if you look at the earlier book, which we must mention, The Midnight Folk, that has no chapter divisions at all. And the magic there happens at night, obviously the Midnight Folk. But although The Box of Delights is a sequel, years, decades have moved on in the narrative, in that Box of Delights is absolutely 1930s, where The Midnight Folk is a Victorian story. So even then, when Masefield is writing two books, he uses time travel between them, as it were. There's this odd correlation, absolutely throwing out the rule book and starting again.
And it is. I mean, Midnight Folk is still, I think, comparatively, slightly more traditional. You know, it's a more easier to follow. It's a more conventional. It's still got characters like, you know, Abner and Pouncer and of course Kate Harker
and Rat.
But it's more the model of a sort of Treasure Island type of story that obviously we know Masefield had read when he went to sea. So Box of Delights is again a very unexpected, as you said, like a time difference, but also, although it picks up some characters, he's not. You know, if John Masefield was writing Netflix seasons, I think the viewers of season 2 of the Kay Harker story would be a bit baffled. Yeah.
I think one of the fun things of looking at the writing of the Box of Delights are the contemporary references, and he brilliantly brought things up to date for the RSC adaptation. The fact I was most delighted about was that in 1935, driving licenses were first issued, so you had to take a driving test. Now the book is littered with references. Of course, you've got the flying car, but Mariah, of course, in the book steals the bishop's car and runs it into a wall. It's a write-off, but there's this whole idea of the cars are a thing, and I think contemporary readers of it would get that humor, would pick up little aspects of Masefield actually as a comic writer.
And he's completely carrying on, of course, from Kenneth Grahame, who is writing, you know, 20 years or so before, who is, when the car is a really new thing, he's horrified by it. Which is why Toad driving a car is actually quite terrifying. Seeing it is a sort of like the modern age, and it's so interesting. Masefield's kind of riffing on that, I think, with Mariah and the car playing, where the car is much more commonplace, but still an object of fascination, dread, danger. You know, as you said, the driving license just introduced thousands of deaths on British roads before that's the case. So
colour and literature, an interesting topic. That's the
whole separate webinar. But it is interesting how he takes these these sort of tropes and details and does his own unique spin on them for this book.
And I think going back to cars, the inspiration for the flying car, there's a letter that Masefield wrote during the First World War back to his wife describing his flight in a plane, and he says that the taking off was a little bit like being in a car. Then of course he became airborne, but when he came back down again, it was again same as being in an automobile, and that's obviously where the inspiration comes from. He hangs on to this from going up during the First World War in a plane, and keeps hold of that. right until the very end, and writing this. The other thing, of course, mentioned about Masefield and cars is that he had his own car, which was called Black Nag, and there's a poem about the car and a journey that he made from Edinburgh back to Oxford at night.
Right.
And how on earth do you write a poem, a narrative about your car journey? But it's a very effective piece of writing about a long car journey, which is a massive adventure. And to set off at the dead of night to do this in a certain number of hours.
Well, it also shows his imagination. And I think there's that lovely bit in the book where Maria is explaining to Peter and Kay that she's been scrobbled in the car plane. And Peter, of course, being a bit of the stick and mud, says, there's no way, Maria, you'd need cylinders and exhaust and all these things that be impossible. And Jesus insists, I tell you, it was going lickety-split. I was in a plane. And which is also why I think children will always find this book appealing, because it takes I think he managed to get inside what a child's head would be to go in any one of those cars.
Yes.
And at that time, particularly, enormously thrilling. And to go that fast, well, why could so easily be in this plane? So it's that fantastic sort of license for the young imagination that he offers.
The other wonderful thing about the book, of course, is the way that we said he breaks the rules, but he blends this mythic folklore aspect with a 1930s gangster story. So you do have characters such as Herne the Hunter, who we know crops up in Merry Wives of Windsor, this folklore character, even going further back, Cole Horlings, who or what is he? But he blends that with, as you said, a modern jewellery heist. It's a weird combination that as you said, breaks all the rules.
But also, I mean, what is completely extraordinary is that, this is a book that is reread every Christmas. This is a book that is watched on TV or at the moment at the theatre every Christmas. The book could not be more Christmassy. It's set the Christmas holidays. The main plot involves someone trying to stop Christmas trying to cancel Christmas by kidnapping clergy. And yet there is actually no Christmas.
That is the
what there is instead of Christmas, and by Christmas what I mean is the kind of business of Christmas that you would get in, say, Christmas Carol, which is all about Christmas and turkey dinner at the Cratchits and buying presents, and there isn't any of that. And what you get is a huge amount of Herne the Hunter and ancient sort of Albion folklore.
And one of the first things that Cole says is, I do date from pagan times. And this is it. What a pagan time doing in a book about Christmas.
So Christian times, as it were, get quite, although the stories about them actually in the body of the book are quite short shrift, which again is one of those odd things about it that makes it so kind of fascinating. And I don't want to say appealing, because I love Christmas, but it's not quite what you expect.
No. It's absolutely the 20th century's equivalent of Christmas Carol, in that this is the novel of Christmas for me that the 20th century produced. I can't think of another Christmassy book in the same way that has an appeal at Christmas. But you're right. Obviously, Dickens has a different purpose for using Christmas to Masefield. For Masefield, it's a sense of community and a sense of sharing a celebration. It's less about Christmas itself. There's a reason for the celebration, but it's not a Christian thing for Masefield.
And I think one of the things he's doing, you're right, and I think one of the things he's doing that I loved about it, I grew up in Northumberland, quite sort of remote countryside, watching the TV and reading the book, is that I think Dickens conveys a brilliant urban Victorian Christmas, the traditions of which obviously persist to this day, partly thanks to Christmas Carol. But what Masefield does, I think, is allows modern readers to enjoy the pleasures of the midwinter feast.
Yes.
And that's the wolves are running, the shadows, the snow is deepening. Come now, Master Harker, the snow is deepening. I'll see you with my Punch and Judy show. And it really is this idea of you draw the curtains, you light the fire, the snow falls, and it's a time to sit and tell stories. And boy, does he tell stories, yarn after yarn about rats at sea, going back in time to the Trojan War, to the Romans, you name it. And that's, in a way, I think, the greatest gift of this book of all is that it just shows the power of storytelling
and the imagination
as part of that festival, and that's the generosity of it. It's not really about anything to do with the birth of Christ or the traditions around that. It's much more around, as you said, community, sharing, closeness,
and
family.
Imagination,
yeah,
which is one of the things that you bring out in your adaptation, but we'll come on to that later. But the point is that it's using your imagination, which is a huge point about the opening. One thing I'd like to briefly touch upon is the inventiveness of Masefield's language. For me, reading the book, it's that joy of discovering new words or really understanding words and trying to look them up in the dictionary, and they're not there. You've got to tease out a meaning for it. This, I think, is part of Masefield's comic genius, that he's using language in an inventive and new way. Yes, we've got slang. So Kay says, I haven't a tosser to my kick, which was a fun one. And you've got the whole scrobbling, phantods, all these, the purple pin, all these great phrases. Masefield's using them because he's for comic effect almost. It grounds it in the 1930s, but he doesn't explain. And I think this comes back to what we were talking about earlier on, the fact that Masefield doesn't explain things. He just presents you with a narrative. He presents you with language, and it's up to you to find your way or not.
Yeah, and what's interesting, of course, is the same time, well, around the same time, Tolkien is inventing lots of words.
Yes.
But of course, Tolkien's an academic, and he does it in a very proper way. He creates glossaries.
Yes.
And any Tolkien fan will know there's huge amounts of concordance on elfin language, hobbit language, all the rest of it, which is great and thrilling and adds a texture to the story, and of course is inspired by, as we know, Icelandic sagas and all sorts of stuff. And the idea of creating language persists. I mean, where with dark materials or alethiometers or Harry Potter and Hogwarts and this kind of spell and that kind of wand and beer beans, what's it called? Beer bean stew, butterbeer. All that.
Have you ever had any butterbeer?
I have in Universal Studios. Right. So, but it's
being recorded, so I won't give my opinion on butterbeer, but never mind.
It's probably the same as mine. It's all of the same world, and I think Masefield as a poet, and again, one foot in the past, one foot in the present. What I love about the language is it's not saying you need to learn language to understand this book, but he's kind of riffing, and he takes things that are real, like possets and buttered eggs, and gives them a kind of prominence that give them this strangeness. And then he invents words like scrobbled and phantods and phrases like the purple pin, which are obviously a slight, I think, kind of satirical comment on the sort of bright young things slang of the day. And it's this amazing mix, really. And you've also got lots of nautical slang, that the piratical stuff and
that's the interesting thing in one respect, that Masefield's early books, poetry, Saltwater Ballads, his first book, is printed with a glossary at the back of naval terms. So he is at pains to point out what these words mean. By the time you get to Box of Lights, he's just not going to bother. It's not essential to understand it. It's just part of who and what he is.
I meant to tell you, actually, that there is a detail in the, we'll talk about it in a minute, but in the RSC version, there's Peter says, I'm going up the stairs to Bedfordshire, which is not from the book, but it is a phrase of the time.
Yes.
And he says, I'm going my book, it's on naval history.
Yes.
But the prop that he uses is an actual copy of John Masefield's book.
Sea Life in Nelson's Time.
On naval history.
Lovely.
I just mentioned that we talk about naval terms.
Very good.
Yeah. So it's a very nerdy detail, but it's kind of lovely.
Must look out for that. So yes, I mean the inventiveness of words, but I think the inventiveness of words is part of Masefield's comic genius in this book. It's actually quite a funny book.
It is funny.
And it's done probably because there's a lightness of touch there.
Yeah.
He never gets heavy. And I often feel that Tolkien gets a bit heavy at times.
Yeah.
But Masefield's got a lightness about him that you don't get.
I think the thing is that I think Tolkien was, I'm not an expert on Tolkien anyway, but he took very seriously these worlds he was creating and took tremendous care over them. You know, The Hobbit is quite a light-hearted book. Lord of the Rings is not a light-hearted series of books. Never mind Silmarillion and all the rest of it. C.S. Lewis, as we know, begins with a picture, begins with this very playful picture of a sleigh and a fawn and so on. But actually, as the books go on, the kind of Christian allegorizing becomes more kind of entrenched, I think, and he becomes more interested in the philosophical and the metaphysical.
You lose that lightness of touch.
You lose the lightness of touch. There are some many great books, but the Box of Lights again stands alone. That I think there is, other than, well, I think we'll come on to in a minute, a quite key message, but there is no message. It is a box of delights. It's in the title. It's an entertainment, which is why I think populist TV series and popular children's books, contemporary ones like Harry Potter and Doctor Who, perhaps borrow inadvertently or advertently so freely from it, because their purpose is to entertain intelligently, thoughtfully, creatively, all those things, but there's no drum they're banging about, you know, the morals of time travel.
Yeah. Must just say that my favourite Masefield Tolkien story is that Masefield was organising the Oxford recitations and required the professor of Middle English or whatever he was at that point to recite some Chaucer. So Masefield contacted Tolkien and said, would you be prepared to recite some Chaucer at my festival? And Tolkien obviously said yes. And Masefield then said, well, the next thing is you have to dress up as Chaucer. So the person who forced Tolkien to wear a Chaucerian outfit, large sort of dress-like thing, was Masefield, which is a lovely little footnote of children's literature. So we haven't got time to talk about the BBC adaptation. You said how important it was to you. And obviously we've timed this so that you should have watched the first episode yesterday, or you should be watching the first episode tomorrow, depending on how you interpret the rules. But we're now in Box of Delights season. It's 6 weeks until Christmas. Magical TV series. And of course we have the boxers. I hope you're all out there watching this. People from the Box of Lights Appreciation Society on Facebook who watch it religiously. Now, I've said the BBC adapted it on radio and then television, and there's been musical versions, there's been a dance adaptation. It gives itself to reinterpretation, which I think is another one of those marks of an interesting core text. But of course, you've now adapted it, should we say twice, or should we just say revised? Because I feel that the new version is very much not, it's obviously got its original version of Wilton's musical, but you really have reimagined it. I think
it's twice, yeah.
It is twice, isn't it?
Yeah.
So tell us more about the background to Wilton's and how that moved on to the Royal Shakespeare Company.
So it really goes back to a long time ago. I mean, obviously falling in love with the TV and the book. And then when I went to university, a couple of friends, we discovered we shared, like many of us all here tonight, this sort of abiding love and memory of the TV series and the book. And we thought it would be fun to do it as we went to drama, do it play at university. Of course, the rights weren't available. They were owned by Nichols, the film director, who had them for a very long time.
He did.
And then many years later, and then I just sort of, it didn't go out of my mind because I loved, but it went, and that side of it went out of my mind. Many years later, the most just incredible stroke of luck, which one of those strokes of luck that was life-changing and I'll always be grateful for. I was writing children's books in a fantasy vein. One of those people ran a theatre, Holly Kendrick, running Wilton's Music Hall, the most extraordinary, beautiful space in East End of London, Britain's oldest surviving music hall. And the other one, Simon Wheeler, was a producer, a TV producer. And he had been able, with Holly, to get the rights after they'd expired from the film option. And we decided, I was invited, amazingly, to be part of this plan to revive our student dreams of doing an adaptation of Box of Delights. And it was quite a thing because it was my first full-length play, and in a music hall, in an 18th century music hall with no wing space, no flying, barely a substage, and
it's quite a restrictive
it's
space.
restricted, you know,
from,
a split. People know there's a raised rear stage and a split fore stage. Again, it's quite tight.
Beautiful building,
beautiful,
difficult to stage.
In which you have, you know, however you do the story, whichever you leave and leave out, you're going to have a flying car. You're going to have someone who walks into a painting.
Yeah.
You're going to have Hearn's Wildwood appearing out of nowhere, and you're going to have Abner falling to his death in a sort of lake flooding some underground prison cells. You can't really do the story. Those are sort of key events. Other things you can leave out. And Holly and Simon assembled this incredible creative team. Justin Audebert, who's now the artistic director of Chichester Festival Theatre, Tom Piper, who people will know from his amazing, beautiful things most famous for was Poppy installation in Tower of London, but has designed many, many wonderful theatre shows. Nina Pittman, a fabulous video designer, Ed Lewis, composer, who did beautiful music that included the a riff on the Healy Harp.
Yes.
And we made the show, and it was an extraordinary, exciting, enthralling experience. And then, but we didn't quite get it right. Then we did it again the next year at Wilson's, and I think we really got some of the story right. But for me, it was just fun of writing stage direction. A car flies across the stage and seeing how that's
up to them to do it.
Up to them to do it. And then we did it again, and then it sort of didn't happen. And then there was COVID. But I'd always hoped that we'd get a chance to do it again. So it's incredibly exciting when the RSC called up last year and said, would you like, we would like, that's what the RSC would say, they said, we would like to do Box of Delights as our Christmas show this year. And it was a different proposition because the Royal Shakespeare, Wilton's Music Hall is an ancient music hall that brings so much character and history with it, and is, I think, 500 seats. And Royal Shakespeare Theatre is a purpose-built theatre on the site of the Old Shakespeare Memorial Theatre, seats 1,400 people, and has incredible technical resource, one of the great privileges and joy of this country. And so we had a larger cast, we had more music, and a very different stage space. And so really the story had to be re-envisioned.
Yeah.
And we made a major decision, which is the one thing we didn't tackle. We could tackle flying cars and stuff, but we didn't tackle the famous dream ending, which is in the book. Kay wakes up and Caroline Louisa says, did you have a nice dream?
Now we can devote an entire webinar on
we could do that
and go through medieval literature, but
which we found difficult. We were doing so much in the Wiltons one to try and tackle that. And the joy of the RSC one is, I think, I don't want to spoil when people come, but I think we found a solution to that. And I know Masefield cared very deeply about that ending. And so it really mattered to me that we could honour that, the spirit of that ending.
Yes. And he did care about the ending. There's a first version of one of the early radio scripts is sent to him, and he rejects it because the dream ending had been rejected.
Yeah.
And he said, "This is not my intention. It has to be a dream."
Yeah.
Where had we got to?
We're talking about the dream ending. Just that for children, it's sort of an instinctive way to end a story, and in popular culture, because of things like Bobby Ewing in Dallas, it's become slightly mocked, the idea that you do a dream as an ending. And actually, I think Masefield was much more imaginative than that. He was really talking, my understanding, of how stories are like dreams. All stories are like dreams. You experience them very intensely, and then they end. The book closes, the box shuts, and the dream is over. And the same kind of way Shakespeare plays with the idea of a dream in Midsummer Night's Dream or The Tempest. That idea of dreams are what really are stories other than waking dreams. If you think about it, they may come from the subconscious, and we only experience the subconscious live when we're asleep and dreaming. So it's not actually as frivolous or as idle as some people think. I think it's not laziness. It's just that the Box of Delights is so wondrous and so magical, and so many things that we've been discussing happen in it, often to contradictory purpose, that actually the only, ironically, for things that are in themselves inherently illogical, the only logical way to conclude it is by saying it's a dream.
It's a dream.
Yeah.
No spoilers for the RSC production, but tickets are still available. It's selling
for November. Yes,
selling well, isn't it?
So if you we'd love anyone to come and see it. It's once we get into Christmas season, tickets are harder to understandably come hard by.
Yeah.
I think midweek is your best shot. For November and December, midweek's your best shot, and November is definitely your best shot overall.
I've been fortunate to see some rehearsals, and I was there on the press night, and it really is a spectacular production. I sat there in wonderment. I was it's a brilliant new take on it, and realized with such honesty and respect for the material, but done in a different way and taking out new messages. So if there's anyone who's within striking distance of Stratford-upon-Avon, please go and see it. And tickets presumably from the RSC website.
Yeah,
there's a good plug.
rsc.org.uk.
Yeah. Whilst we're plugging, I should mention that, of course, Peter Harrington is a very great rare bookshop. We have a copy of the first edition there, rebound by the Chelsea Bindery. Should show you there the original end papers are illustrations by Judith Masefield, who was John Masefield's daughter. It's beautiful first edition. We have one of those in stock at the moment, should anyone be interested. So I think we should go to the questions as we are in our final few moments, and let's see if we have any. Let me just click on there. So we've got a question. We've got a question here from Sophie, who says, what do you most regret about not including in the RSC production?
It's a good question. The reality is it's a family show at Christmas, so we've had a lot of children coming. We're expecting a lot more children to come, but children do also go to school and can't go to bed too late. So our running time is 2 hours 20 minutes, including interval, and so there just isn't. We can't do it in such an expansive book, and so we made a decision very reluctantly early on that two things we couldn't do is we couldn't really do all the time travel back to places like Rome and Troy, just because to stage that, because we have our central settings.
Although the RSC would have done it so well.
They would have done it so well. We'll do a sequel. They, like most plays, there are central settings. So there's Seeking's House, there's the Missionary College, there's Tatchester Cathedral, and so on. To then do on a Bottlers Down, to then do on top of that, Rome, Troy, and Arthur's Camp, all of which I love in the book and the TV series. And in workshops, so that was a decision I made even before I'd adapted the thing. Just we had to be realistic. And in workshops of the original production, we realized that we had more rats and pirates, and that was just also going to be impossible to achieve. And so we've just got one brilliant rat.
Rat is phenomenal.
Rat is phenomenal.
Absolutely phenomenal.
Rat is phenomenal.
And I'm glad to say the green cheese, anybody who knows the book and the TV series, the green cheese is
very much
retained
and closing any tavern down.
Very good. So Caroline asks, why isn't John Masefield better known today? Again, a subject that we could spend an entire webinar on. Basically, my view on this is that Masefield took some very bad business decisions, in that when he was approached, when people asked if they could make adaptations, films, and use his work, he generally held out for aggressive business deals. So the one that I most mourn, I suppose, is the Richard Burton film of a biblical play, Good Friday. He was approached in the 1960s and asked whether he would give permission, and permission was denied. Now, if we'd had Richard Burton in a biblical drama that was shown every Easter, you would kind of have more of a knowledge of Masefield. The films, there are large number of films that were never made because Masefield held out for these aggressive deals, and also publishing deals. Penguin came to him in the 1960s, asking for him to embrace the paperback revolution. And again, Masefield just wasn't interested. So a few bad decisions, but the work that is out there, it's not all like the Box of Delights, because we're talking about two children's books. But from what I was saying earlier on with The Everlasting Mercy, there are these works that really remade certain parts of English literature. The Everlasting Mercy hasn't been in print since the 1970s, yet it's an important work. Sissoon, for example, parodied it, and actually he did this parody and then had to admit that he was writing proper poetry in trying to make a parody of Masefield. And he's credited as saying, "This is the time I started writing poetry, proper poetry from the start." Other questions? Let's see. The idea that you can only go swift or small from a magical device seems so old-fashioned compared to modern fantasy ideas. Yes, it is old-fashioned, but as Piers was saying, it's really the beginning of it and where it comes from. So thank you, Keith. Yes, he says, "I love that Masefield could only imagine those concepts." Absolutely. Let's see, any other questions that we've got? Is Masefield unique in drawing on the pagan and Christian stories?
I'm not sure he is. I mean, it's Wind in the Willows, of course, has the famous scene with Pan. Mole and Rat go down the river looking for little Portly, the lost otter, Otter's lost son, and they discover Portly's safe after all with Pan, this incredibly slightly homoerotic sort of Greek figure, which is a bit unexpected in a story about toads and moles and caravans. But it was a tradition, I think, of where those things were more easily sort of blended. And of course, look at the poetry of the time of Yeats and so on. It's all full of all that stuff. So I think particularly for a poet, it wasn't that unusual. And actually something we haven't really talked about enough is I do think Masefield, where Masefield is so different to nearly all the other writers we've talked about, is he was a poet. And I think it's that lyric imagination which allows for that, you know, you're more open to sort of, you perhaps take metaphor more literally, I think, than prose writers do and so on.
But the other thing I should say about Masefield's prose writing is that I feel that it's written with the precision of a poet.
Yeah.
There are certain words that only that word will do, and it's measured. There's a certain meter to it.
Yeah.
Actually, some of Masefield's prose is, you can tell he is a poet. It's beautifully written.
And that's why it's a joy to adapt, because so many of the phrases and the dialogue are already beautifully formed lines. You know, often books you remember as being brilliant when you actually try and take them apart. Like Dickens, for example, there's some good lines in Christmas Carol, but actually a lot of what people say is quite workmanlike. It's not right. I know there are famous like "God bless us everyone" and, you know, Marley and all that, but there are some standout phrases.
Some of them are quite clumsy, but the construction is
it's not as exquisitely rendered as Masefield. No.
There we are. You heard it here first. Masefield is a better writer than Dickens. Discuss.
More easygoing.
So thank you very much, Piers. I've really enjoyed talking about my favourite book. It's absolutely my desert island book. I've, as I said earlier on, I've produced an edition of it. So I've pored over every single word from the manuscript and then the proof and read it practically backwards. It still has all its delights intact for me, and I heartily recommend it. So thank you very much for joining us. We've run a little bit over time, but we had a little bit of a blip in the middle. Anybody who missed any of it or would like to see any of it again, of it, and I think we'll send out an email. But I'd just like to say, Piers, thank you again for
pleasure
for coming.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, everyone, for watching.